All right, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. So today we are going to be getting into early American politics. Uh, so this is going to be like the generation after the founding fathers. This is like the 1820s, through the 1840s primarily that we're talking about today. So we'll be starting with what is called the Jacksonian era. This is the time when it's known as the age of the common man, because politics is going to be brought down from not only just the rich and wealthy people, but it's going to start including more of the everyday person in politics. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. So some characteristics of it: heightened emphasis on equality when it comes to politics for white men. So we're going to have a rise in interest groups for politics, and we're going to see campaigning starting to be more appealing to the common man, to the everyday person, to the regular guys. And we're going to have a lot more voter participation at state and national levels during this time. All right. Now, Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He is running for the presidency in 1824. He wins the popular vote between four candidates, but there was no clear winner because none of them actually won the majority of the Electoral College votes needed to win. So one of the other candidates, Henry Clay, he withdrew, and this allowed his votes, his Electoral College votes, to go to John Quincy Adams, to be being chosen by the House of Representatives, and Clay would become the Secretary of State. That was some backhanded deal making that was going on between Clay and Adams. Jackson, of course, and rightly so, would have been furious over this, and it's going to have some very sore feelings there. But come the election of 1828, we're going to see a lot more suffrage, meaning more people are allowed to vote. So first it was just like if you're a more well-to-do land-owning white male, but now it is universal white male suffrage. All white men who are citizens and above, like the age of 18, they are allowed to vote. So there's more people allowed to vote. We have more political activism going on, and we're having, there were 4 people running for president last time. Now we're going to start having people being chosen to represent political parties through conventions, like how we have the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention now to choose who is going to represent that political party in like a presidential election. That is basically getting its start in 1828. Now, all Americans were equal at the ballot box, and now, because of more men being able to vote, more regular guys, and Jackson was a hero of the people because of things like the War of 1812, he is going to win, and he wins. It's pretty obvious that he won the election. So we now have a new thing going on. The election of Andrew Jackson comes when we're having a lot more people participating in politics, like we've already talked about. And this is going to replace the previous one that I've talked about, where it's more of an aristocratic type of deal where just the rich people are involved. And now we're having this new wave of interest in politics. Everybody wants to get involved. And just as a little side note, see that picture there at the bottom? Depiction showing how Jackson opened up the White House to the public for his inauguration. Basically what that means is he had the equivalent of a frat party for his inauguration at the White House, and it was just a gigantic house party. So people from all over, the DC area came to the White House and just partied. And that was pretty much how it went. Okay. Now, Jackson's president. he's going to have something called the spoils system. So he hired people who supported him in becoming the president and gave them government jobs. To the victor go the spoils. I won, I get to do what I want. So a little bit of corruption in there, right? We're going to get increased involvement by ordinary people. And it's because, say I was a supporter of Jackson. I helped get him a lot of votes. I helped him, win in, let's say North Carolina. I helped him win the electoral votes there. So I want a specific job. Let's say I want to be the Secretary of the Treasury. I'm not qualified to be Secretary of the Treasury, but he's going to give me that job because I helped him out. And because I don't know what I'm doing, maybe I'm starting to skim some money off the top a little bit. That's kind of what was going on. All right. Under Jackson, we're also going to get the Indian Removal Act, which basically is the Trail of Tears. This is when Jackson is going to forcefully remove Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. One of the biggest ones that was moved was the Cherokee Nation. He moves them from out of Georgia and other southern tribes out of their areas and basically forces them to march halfway across the continent to Oklahoma to be resettled on reservations. He was told by the Supreme Court, you cannot do this. He refused to listen to them and did it anyway. But they couldn't really do anything to him because he was just so popular, and this horrendous thing actually made him even more popular. So they couldn't touch him. All right. Jackson founded the Democratic Party, like the party that we know of now as the Democrats. It originated with Andrew Jackson back in the 1820s. So their main goals: extending political powers, more people being allowed to vote. They did not like the national bank. They opposed the American system, which was proposed by Henry Clay. Jackson and Clay did not get along at all. They supported the Indian Removal Act and expansion of territory, like getting more and more of the West. And they were not sure how they felt about tariffs, the trade taxes. All right, just a little more idea of what the American system is. This system basically has three parts: a tariff to protect and promote American industry, so keeping our prices more reasonable and putting taxes on foreign goods. The national bank would help support the commerce system, so it would make the money move more, it would make it move better, so more people would be able to make money. And federal subsidies for roads, canals, and other internal improvements. So basically building up the infrastructure, making things a lot easier, more marketable. All right, and this would have been a very nice system for the U.S. to have in place, but Andrew Jackson, because he doesn't like Henry Clay, said, no, we're not going to do this. All right, now Federalists, that party is still around. They're gone. This is basically the end of them, but new political parties are brought into existence to oppose the Democrats. One being the Whigs. They saw Jackson as a tyrant, and they basically they wanted to just fight him on everything. And then there was another one called the Know Nothings, who basically were against immigration to the United States from other countries. The Know Nothings were not nearly as big a deal as the Whigs. The Whigs actually had some good momentum going for them. All right, the legacy of Jackson. So extension of suffrage, more people are allowed to vote. The spoils system, where he's given jobs to people who helped him out. We are seeing the presidential powers being strengthened by public opinion. So because the people support the president, the government can't really, like Congress and the Supreme Court can't really do too much to him. He used the veto a lot, the presidential veto, where he basically is like, no, we're not going to do that law. No, we're not going to do this law. I don't like that, so no. And he could basically just get rid of whatever he didn't want so that Congress couldn't pass any laws. The Indian Removal Act, and we have a big economic crisis because of Jackson, and yeah, because he had idiots running the banks, basically. All right, that is where we are leaving off with Jackson, but we're going to get into some social things that are happening in the United States during this time period from the 1820s through like the 1840s and even into the 1860s, you could say. All right, first thing is the Second Great Awakening. This is a big spiritual revitalization, a lot of interest in religion during this time, and social reforms that are going to come from this, awakening or reawakening in religion. All right, we're going to get the temperance movement, abolitionism, and women's rights during these years. All right, first, let's talk about the Second Great Awakening itself a little bit. This was basically a series of revivals. Like, you ever been to a church revival where it's like everybody's real upbeat and into it, and there's just a lot of praise and preaching going on? Memberships in churches are going to just skyrocket during this time. By 1840, half of the adult population in the country was connected to church of some kind, with a lot of it being Methodists. And we're going to see, society during Jackson was going through a lot of change, obviously. And we're going to see a lot of expansion economically and some depressions. And to combat the uncertainty of all that, that is why a lot of people are turning to religion. There's so much more interest because it's something to help give them hope, even when things are not looking so good, with the country. All right. Now, the temperance movement. Temperance is basically dealing with alcohol consumption. By 1830, Americans drank an average of 5 gallons of liquor a year. That's a lot of liquor. And this is like hard liquor, like whiskey and stuff like that. Reformers argue that drinking caused domestic violence, public rowdiness, and loss of family income. Generally speaking, that is true. The real problem is basically that Americans at this time had a really bad habit of drinking all day. So partially, we can say that it is because alcohol was safer to drink than other things like water or milk or things like that, because of bacteria that might be in those. But typically, they don't survive in alcohol. All right. Most significant reform movement of this period sought to withdraw from society, but to change it directly. So the whole idea here was to get rid of alcohol consumption. So this was largely led by pastors, the clergy, the church, and they opposed drunkenness and did not oppose moderate drinking. So basically, hey, it's okay to have a drink from time to time, but don't go overboard. So yeah, and that was the main goal early on. So the temperance movement is going to see a big surgence in the late 18 teens, early 1820s, and there's going to be temperance societies founded all over the place. And like, these are like clubs all over the place where they are supporting this and they're promoting it in their communities. And as you can see here, there was a big spike in alcohol consumption during this time period. And because of the temperance movement, it kind of slows down a little bit over the following decades. All right. So this right here, it would have been something that the temperance movement people would have been showing. It's basically the idea that, like, okay, decent guy, starts drinking, starts, associating with the wrong types of people, starts getting into fights, starts drinking and gambling, lets himself fall apart, basically turns into a slob and, starts robbing people, eventually committing suicide. These are the 9 steps of alcoholism, according to the temperance movement back in the 1840s. All right. And there it is explained a little bit more. Okay, now let's talk about women in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s. They are not able to vote. They have very little legal status, so they can barely do anything in court. If you are a single woman, you can own your own property, but once you get married, that property becomes your husband's, and your children are basically the property of your husband. You could not initiate a divorce, your husband had to, and you couldn't make any wills or sign any contracts without your husband's permission. Yeah, not exactly great. All right, separate spheres concept. So, Republican motherhood, we're starting to see a cult of domesticity, of domestics now. A woman's sphere was the home, the woman's place is in the home. This is an idea of thinking that's going on in the 1800s. Her role is to civilize her husband and family, basically keep everything neat and tidy and make sure that your family is as well. Right. In the 1830s, a Massachusetts minister would say this: the power of woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on man to become a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural. So basically, if a woman doesn't make herself subservient to a man, we got a problem. That's essentially what he's saying there. It's pretty messed up. All right. Another part of the cult of domesticity is slavery. Second Great Awakening is going to inspire women to improve society in general. So we have some Southern abolitionists who were women, like Angelina Grimke and Sarah Grimke. And we also have Lucy Stone, who was part of the Women's Suffrage Association, and she was a woman writer for a women's publication, the Women's Journal. Right? We're going to have the women's rights movement. This is a big, big deal for the women's rights that we have today. This is the foundation of it all. So when abolitionists divided over the issue of female participation, so abolitionists, the people who want to get rid of slavery, they were divided over female participation. Women found it easy to identify with the situation of slaves because, they were second-class citizens. They couldn't own property if they were married. They couldn't do this if they were married. So in 1848, feminists are going to reform and have a convention of their own, Seneca Falls. And it basically is the beginning of the modern women's rights movement. All right. Seneca Falls, New York, 1849. They're talking about the educational and professional opportunities for women in the future, property rights, legal equality, repealing of laws awarding the father custody of the children in divorce, and voting rights, suffrage rights. These are all things that they're discussing in their convention. All right. Now, I'm going to have an excerpt from the Seneca Falls Declaration, which was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the biggest leaders of the women's rights movement of the 1800s. Now, basically what this is, they took the Declaration of Independence and they made some editing to it. So, for example, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So notice there's men and women. Right, Susan B. Anthony, another one of these early leaders in the women's rights movement. The married woman and their legal status. What is servitude? The condition of a slave. What is a slave? A person who is robbed of the proceeds of his labor, a person who is subject to the will of another. All right. Basically, that is her justification for comparing women of the 1800s to slaves, which, when you look at it from that perspective, kind of makes sense. All right, now let's switch full gear into abolitionism. That is the practice of trying to end slavery. And we have, for example, William Lloyd Garrison, the guy who was the publisher of The Liberator. It was a newspaper that basically would send shockwaves throughout the country, and it would be promoting the abolitionist movement. He's going to be promoting, racial equality and, saying that slaves should be compensated, for their work, and people who are slaveholders who free their slaves should be compensated as well. Try and make things as even as possible. All right. We also have here, who was an escaped slave from Maryland, Frederick Douglass, who would escape to the North, and he would be a part of the abolitionist movement. And he was great. He was a great leader, been getting a lot of stuff done. He served as a great example of like what a slave could aspire to when given freedom and the chance to better themselves. All right. And of course, there were people, abolitionists, who were helping with the Underground Railroad. And let's just talk about this real quick. These were people who would help slaves escape from the South to the North. So we have conductors, people who would actually guide and lead slaves from plantations or wherever in the South through all the wilderness to the North. Passengers, of course, being the slaves. Tracks were the routes and trails that they took. Trains, that would be farm wagons and transporting the escaping slaves. And depots were the safe houses where they could rest, whether it was an old shed in the backyard or if it was underneath the crawl space of a house, just anywhere that they could hide from anyone who was looking for them. All right, that's where we're ending today. And be sure to come back next time when we will be continuing our discussion on the years leading up to the American Civil War.